In the early 19th century, the science of ancient life barely existed. Fossils had been found for centuries, but they were treated more like curiosities than evidence of a lost world. People believed giant bones belonged to biblical beasts, dragons, or simply oversized versions of modern animals. No one yet understood extinction properly, and no one imagined entire ecosystems had vanished long before humans existed. Into this uncertainty stepped a handful of naturalists who were trying to build a new field from fragments. They had almost nothing to work with: a single tooth, a broken femur, a piece of jaw. From these scraps they attempted something extraordinary: reconstruct creatures no human had ever seen alive. The result was both brilliant and disastrously wrong. One of the most famous mistakes in the history of science began with a few teeth discovered in England in 1822. The local doctor and fossil collector Gideon Mantell examined them closely. They were unlike the teeth of mammals, crocodiles, or fish. Instead, they resembled the teeth of an iguana, but far larger. Mantell realized he was looking at a reptile of enormous size. He named it Iguanodon, meaning iguana tooth. At the time, reptiles were thought of as slow, sprawling animals that hugged the ground. There was no concept of dynamic dinosaurs. The word dinosaur itself had not even been invented yet. Scientists assumed any giant reptile must resemble a lizard scaled up to monstrous proportions. Mantell tried to imagine the creature's full body, but he had almost nothing. Teeth, some bones, and fragments that were badly preserved. He made cautious interpretations, but the fossil record soon expanded when miners and quarry workers uncovered more pieces. Among them was a peculiar conical bone shaped like a spike. No one knew what it was. The spike did not resemble a tooth. It was too thick and solid. It was not part of the spine. It was not a rib. It was smooth and sharply pointed. Without living analogues, scientists tried the most logical approach available to them. Compare it to known reptiles. Large reptiles often possessed horns or nasal ornaments. Rhinos had horns. Some lizards had cranial spikes. So the conclusion seemed straightforward. The spike must belong on the nose. The first full reconstruction of Iguanodon was created in the 1830s. It showed a massive lizard-like creature walking on four legs, dragging a heavy tail behind it. The head was bulky and blunt, and prominently placed above the snout was a large horn, giving the animal a rhinoceros-like appearance. This reconstruction became widely accepted. Illustrations spread through books and museums. The public saw Iguanodon as a gigantic armored lizard, a slow, swamp-dwelling brute pushing through vegetation. The image fit the Victorian worldview perfectly. Prehistoric life was primitive, inferior, and clumsy compared to modern animals. The confidence in this reconstruction hardened over decades. Artists painted scenes of lumbering reptilian monsters basking in steaming jungles. Educators taught children about ancient horned reptiles. Entire generations learned a creature that had never existed. Then something remarkable happened. In 1878, miners digging coal in Bernissart, Belgium, uncovered an underground chamber filled with dozens of articulated skeletons. For the first time, scientists did not have fragments, they had nearly complete bodies. Multiple individuals preserved together in three-dimensional detail. When the skeletons were assembled, the horn vanished. The mysterious spike did not attach to the nose at all. Instead, it belonged on the hand. Specifically, it was a thumb spike projecting outward from the animal's forelimb. The shock was enormous. For more than 50 years, the defining feature of one of the most famous prehistoric animals had been completely misplaced. The creature was not a rhinoceros lizard. It was something far stranger. The new reconstruction showed a large biped capable of standing upright, balancing with a stiff tail. The forelimbs were flexible and dexterous. The thumb spike likely served as a defensive weapon against predators or rivals. But the mistake revealed a deeper problem. Scientists had not only mislocated a bone, they had misunderstood the entire posture and lifestyle of the animal. Early naturalists believed large reptiles must move slowly and sprawl. Yet the Belgian skeletons demonstrated Iguanodon could rear onto two legs. Its hips and tail formed a counterbalance similar to modern birds. The creature had been active, mobile, and probably social. The old museum statues suddenly looked absurd. Massive sculptures already built from stone could not easily be changed. Visitors continued to see outdated reconstructions even as scientific papers corrected them. For decades, the wrong animal stood physically in front of the public, while the right one existed only in academic drawings. This marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across paleontology. Once an image captured the public imagination, it became difficult to erase. Each new fossil had to fight against the weight of previous belief. Iguanodon was not alone. Other early dinosaurs suffered similar fates. Bones were assigned incorrectly. Postures were guessed based on modern reptiles. Entire anatomies were forced into familiar categories because unfamiliar possibilities seemed implausible. The thumb spike error illustrates a fundamental limitation of early science. Researchers were not foolish. They were reasoning carefully using the information available. The real issue was incompleteness. A handful of bones cannot easily reveal motion, behavior, or stance. When the mind fills gaps, it uses analogy, and analogy can mislead. In the 19th century, no one had ever seen a giant land animal walk upright with a horizontal spine except birds. And birds were not yet connected to reptiles in any meaningful evolutionary framework. The concept that dinosaurs could be bird-like would have seemed nonsensical. So the bones were forced into the only framework that made sense at the time: giant lizard. The discovery at Bernissart forced scientists to accept a new reality. Extinct animals might not resemble any modern creature. Ancient ecosystems might operate under entirely different rules. Reconstruction required caution rather than assumption. The lesson was expensive. Museums had invested huge resources into displays. Books had circulated worldwide. The public had internalized a prehistoric world that never existed. Correcting that world would take generations. And Iguanodon would become the first famous example of a prehistoric animal humanity confidently imagined, confidently taught, and confidently misunderstood. The discovery in Belgium did more than correct a misplaced spike. It forced scientists to reconsider how they thought about extinct life itself. Until that moment, prehistoric animals had been reconstructed almost like puzzles, where missing pieces were filled by imagination, guided by modern creatures. But the Bernissart skeletons revealed a danger hidden inside that method. If the comparison animal was wrong, then every conclusion built on top of it would also be wrong. When researchers began carefully studying the articulated skeletons, they noticed something even stranger than the thumb spike. The hips and hind limbs were built for bearing most of the animal's weight. The femur angled inward, not outward like a lizard. The joints were aligned beneath the body rather than sprawled to the sides. This was not a crawling reptile. It was an animal designed for efficient walking, possibly even running. Yet for decades prior, entire theories about prehistoric climates had depended on the belief that dinosaurs were sluggish, cold-blooded swamp creatures. Many scientists assumed these animals needed water to support their mass because their limbs could not carry them on land. If Iguanodon could stand upright and move actively across dry terrain, then the environment it lived in must also be different from what had been imagined. Paleontology at the time was closely tied to geology. Fossils were used to reconstruct ancient worlds. But when the animals themselves were reconstructed incorrectly, the environments built around them became equally distorted. Marshes were drawn where forests existed. Heat was assumed where moderate climates prevailed. The biology of one animal influenced the interpretation of an entire planet. Another misconception emerged from the tale. Earlier reconstructions showed the tail dragging on the ground like that of a crocodile. Artists carved deep grooves in the earth behind walking dinosaurs. But the Belgian specimens preserved the tail stiffened by interlocking bones and tendons. It could not droop downward easily. Instead, it formed a rigid counterbalance, extending straight behind the body. This meant Iguanodon walked with its body held horizontally, not vertically. The backbone formed a near straight line from head to tail. Such posture suggested speed, coordination, and energy efficiency. The animal's center of mass rested above its hips, allowing long-distance travel rather than short, lumbering steps. the implications stretched further. If one dinosaur moved this way, perhaps others did too. But many researchers resisted. The older vision of prehistoric life had become culturally embedded. Museums displayed heavy reptilian monsters. Changing them meant admitting foundational assumptions were flawed. Scientific pride is rarely comfortable with rapid reversal. Still, the evidence accumulated. Trackways discovered in sedimentary rock began matching the new posture. Footprints appeared in sequences, showing animals walking upright without tail marks. Entire herds left parallel tracks, moving in the same direction, implying coordinated group behavior. A slow swamp dweller could not produce such patterns. Gradually, the scientific community adjusted. Textbooks were rewritten. New skeletal mounts were constructed. Instead of four-legged statues, museums built bipedal forms with raised tails. Yet, the transformation was slow. Some institutions kept outdated displays for decades simply because replacing them was expensive and technically challenging. During this period, another misunderstanding surfaced. The hands of Iguanodon possessed flexible finger feeding. This contradicted the earlier image of a simple reptile that snapped indiscriminately at plants. Microscopic wear patterns on the teeth later revealed complex chewing motions. The jaw moved in multiple directions, slicing and crushing plant fibers efficiently. Such mechanisms required advanced musculature and coordination. The animal's brain, once assumed primitive, had to be capable of controlling intricate movements. This realization subtly shifted perceptions about dinosaur intelligence. They were no longer viewed as reflex-driven reptiles, but as animals with behaviors approaching those of modern large herbivores. Social herds became plausible. Migration patterns became plausible. Parental care became plausible. All these insights originated from correcting a single misplaced bone. The Iguanodon case demonstrated a principle that would haunt paleontology for the next century. Small anatomical errors cascade into massive conceptual errors. One incorrect assumption about posture leads to mistaken locomotion. Mistaken locomotion leads to mistaken metabolism. Mistaken metabolism leads to mistaken climate reconstruction. Even after corrections, echoes of imagination preserved a fossilized version of scientific misunderstanding long after the science itself evolved. Scientists began adopting stricter reconstruction standards. Instead of forcing fossils into familiar shapes, they analyzed biomechanics mathematically. Joint angles were tested for realistic movement. Muscle attachments were estimated based on bone scars. Comparative anatomy expanded beyond reptiles to include birds and mammals. This methodological shift slowly reshaped the field from speculative artistry into a more quantitative discipline. Paleontology became less about visual resemblance and more about functional possibility. Could the bones physically support that posture? Could the joints rotate that way? Could the animal breathe efficiently in that stance? Iguanodon became a teaching example for students entering the discipline, not simply as an herbivorous dinosaur, but as a warning. Evidence must guide imagination, not the reverse. When data is incomplete, confidence must remain provisional. By the end of the 19th century, the image of prehistoric life had already begun transforming. Dinosaurs were no longer monstrous lizards inhabiting stagnant swamps. They were terrestrial animals, adapted to diverse environments, capable of movement and behavior comparable to living fauna. But the lesson was not fully learned. Similar misunderstandings still lay ahead in marine reptiles, giant birds, and even the most iconic predators. The first backward dinosaur had opened the door to a larger realization. Humanity had not merely discovered ancient life, it had projected its own expectations onto it, and the process of separating reality from assumption had only just begun. By the early 19th century, the idea of ancient reptiles had finally begun to settle into scientific thought. Dinosaurs were being named, fossils were being catalogued, and museums were starting to display skeletons for the public. But while land animals were slowly being corrected, the oceans remained a far deeper mystery. People understood the sea even less than the land. Much of the ocean was unexplored, and strange creatures occasionally washed ashore, already half decomposed and unrecognizable. Sailors told stories of serpents long enough to coil around ships. These stories were not dismissed outright. At the time, science itself had not ruled out monsters. So when fossil hunters began discovering enormous marine skeletons embedded in seaside cliffs, interpretation was influenced not only by biology, but by centuries of myth. Along the southern coast of England, particularly near Lyme Regis, cliffs constantly eroded under waves and storms. Each winter storms exposed new fossils, and a young fossil collector named Mary Anning became one of the most important figures in paleontology. She found skeletons unlike anything known to science. One of her discoveries would completely reshape understanding of prehistoric oceans, but only after decades of misunderstanding. The first skeleton she uncovered belonged to a creature with a long snout filled with sharp teeth. Its body was streamlined, and its eyes were enormous. But the tail and fins were poorly preserved, and the spine appeared similar to reptiles found on land. Naturalists immediately categorized it as a sea lizard. This classification seemed logical. Reptiles already existed in water. Crocodiles, turtles, and sea snakes were familiar examples. Therefore, a giant marine reptile must behave like an oversized version of them. Slow, cold-blooded, surfacing often and hunting in shallow water. The creature was named Ichthyosaurus, meaning fish lizard. The name itself reveals the confusion. Scientists could not decide whether it was more fish or reptile. In truth, it was neither in the expected sense. Early reconstructions portrayed Ichthyosaurus as a long serpentine animal slithering through the sea using sideways undulation like an eel. Its limbs were imagined as paddles, used mainly for steering while the body provided propulsion. This matched the behavior of known aquatic reptiles and therefore seemed safe. But the fossils held clues that were initially overlooked. The eyes were enormous, far larger than most reptiles. Inside the eye sockets were rings of bony plates forming a rigid structure. No one understood their purpose. Some suggested protection from water pressure. Others thought they helped focus vision in murky water, but their significance was underestimated. The vertebrae were tightly packed, limiting sideways flexibility more than expected. The tailbones hinted at a downward bend near the end, though the soft tissue shape was unknown. Without preserved skin, artists defaulted to familiar reptilian shapes. For decades, museum displays showed Ichthyosaurus as a crocodile-like swimmer cruising near the surface, waiting for prey. This reinforced a broader assumption that prehistoric seas were dominated by primitive reptiles, replacing fish as top predators, but behaving in similarly slow ways. Then, new specimens changed everything. Exceptionally preserved fossils were discovered in Germany, entombed in fine sediment that captured outlines of skin and fins. For the first time, the full body shape appeared. The tail did not taper like a lizard. It expanded into a vertical, crescent-shaped fin, remarkably similar to that of a modern dolphin or shark. This single feature overturned decades of assumptions. A vertical tail cannot move effectively by side-to-side undulation of a flexible body. Instead, it requires powerful up and down strokes driven by strong muscles along the spine. The body must remain relatively stiff, cutting through water at high speed. Ichthyosaurus had not been a drifting reptile. It had been a fast pursuit predator. Further examination of the ribcage revealed a deep chest capable of housing large lungs. Combined with the huge eyes, scientists reconsidered the animal's lifestyle. Large eyes gather more light, useful, not near the bright surface, but in dim depths. The bony eye rings now made sense. They supported the eyeball against pressure during deep dives. This animal hunted in darkness, far below the waves. Stomach contents, preserved inside some fossils, showed remains of fish and squid, like cephalopods. Some specimens even contained embryos inside the body cavity, indicating live birth rather than egg laying on land. That single discovery shattered another long-standing assumption. The animal never needed to return to shore. It was fully adapted to open ocean life. Modern comparisons shifted dramatically. Instead of crocodiles, researchers compared it to dolphins and tuna. Its shape minimized drag. Its tail generated thrust. Its fins stabilized direction. Its metabolism may even have been warm-blooded to sustain constant swimming. But accepting this required abandoning a comfortable narrative. For decades, prehistoric reptiles had been categorized as evolutionary failures, inferior prototypes before mammals rose to dominance. Yet, Ichthyosaurus showed a reptile independently evolving solutions nearly identical to advanced marine mammals millions of years later. Evolution had repeated a design because physics demanded it. The implications extended beyond a single species. Entire marine ecosystems had been reconstructed under the assumption of sluggish predators. Now scientists realized ancient oceans contained fast-moving hunters capable of chasing prey across vast distances. Prehistoric seas were dynamic environments filled with speed and competition. Mary Anning's fossil had revealed a creature more similar to a dolphin than a lizard, but it took nearly half a century for the scientific community to fully accept what the bones had been saying all along. The sea monster had never been a monster at all. It had been a perfectly engineered swimmer, misjudged because humans expected the past to resemble the present. Once the true shape of Ichthyosaurus became clear, scientists were forced to re-examine fossils that had already been sitting in collections for decades. Specimens that once appeared ordinary suddenly contained overlooked details. The more closely researchers looked, the more the animal resisted the traditional reptile label. One of the first puzzles involved breathing. Reptiles living in water today, such as crocodiles, surface frequently and move slowly between dives. Their lungs and metabolism limit how long they can remain submerged. Yet Ichthyosaurus possessed proportions inconsistent with such behavior. The ribcage was large and barrel-shaped, suggesting significant oxygen storage capacity. Combined with its streamlined body, this implied prolonged swimming between breaths. But the most compelling evidence came from the bones themselves. Chemical analysis of fossilized tissue revealed patterns consistent with sustained activity rather than short bursts of movement. In modern animals, fast, continuous swimmers develop dense vascularized bone to support high metabolic demands. Ichthyosaurus showed similar characteristics. This suggested an uncomfortable possibility for 19th century naturalists. The animal might have maintained a body temperature higher than its surroundings. In other words, it may not have been cold-blooded. At the time, the concept of a warm-blooded reptile challenged accepted biological order. Reptiles were supposed to be sluggish, dependent on environmental heat, and incapable of sustained pursuit. Mammals and birds occupied the active niche. Yet here was a marine reptile, apparently built for endurance, swimming in cold water, potentially diving to depths where sunlight barely penetrated. The eyes reinforced this interpretation. The enormous diameter allowed maximum light capture, while the bony support ring kept the eyeball from deforming under pressure. Such adaptation only makes sense for animals descending hundreds of meters below the surface. In those depths, a slow reptile would fail to catch prey. Only speed and precision would work. More fossils soon revealed. tooth wear patterns indicating active hunting of agile prey. Squid possess rapid escape jets and complex movement patterns. A sluggish ambush predator would struggle to capture them regularly. Yet squid remains were common inside preserved stomach cavities. Even more striking were the embryos. Several specimens preserved unborn, young, oriented tail first within the mother's body. This is identical to the birth orientation of whales and dolphins, preventing drowning during delivery. The conclusion became unavoidable. Ichthyosaurus spent its entire life at sea, never crawling onto land, never basking on shorelines, never laying eggs in sand. This was not a reptile that returned to water. It was a lineage that had fully committed to the ocean. As acceptance grew, the consequences expanded beyond Ichthyosaurus. Another marine reptile, long depicted as a serpentine monster, began receiving renewed scrutiny. This creature, with an extremely long neck and small head, had inspired countless illustrations of sea serpents. It was named Plesiosaurus. Early reconstructions imagined it slithering through water like a snake, using lateral body waves for propulsion. But the preserved skeleton showed something peculiar. The neck was flexible, but the torso was rigid and wide. 4 large flippers extended from the body, far too symmetrical for steering alone. Engineers and biologists studied the joint structure and realized the flippers moved in coordinated strokes similar to underwater flight. Instead of wriggling like a snake, the animal likely flew through water like a penguin or sea turtle, generating lift with each stroke. The long neck allowed sudden strikes at fish, while the body remained stable. The old image of a drifting serpent gave way to that of a controlled and efficient swimmer. The prehistoric ocean was no longer filled with primitive monsters, but with specialized animals occupying ecological roles familiar in modern seas. The shift also changed public perception of extinction. Previously, ancient creatures were viewed as crude ancestors, replaced by superior modern forms. Now it became clear that some extinct animals were not inferior at all. They were highly adapted specialists, perfectly suited to their time. Their disappearance was not inevitable progress, but the result of changing environments and catastrophic events. Scientists began reinterpreting ocean sediments accordingly. Fast predators imply fast prey. Schools of fish must have been abundant. Cephalopods must have flourished. Entire food webs had to be reconstructed from a dynamic perspective rather than a stagnant swamp model. The Victorian sea monster slowly disappeared from textbooks. In its place emerged an ocean that felt alive and modern in structure despite its immense age. The creatures inhabiting it were not evolutionary experiments fumbling toward perfection. They were solutions engineered by natural selection, sometimes arriving at designs nearly identical to animals that would evolve millions of years later. The case of Ichthyosaurus established a powerful lesson repeated throughout paleontology. superficial resemblance to modern reptiles led scientists to incorrect conclusions about behavior. Only when anatomy was examined through physics and function did the truth emerge. Ancient life was not simply a primitive version of the present. It was a parallel world shaped by the same natural laws, but expressed through different lineages. The sea monster had never been a slow lizard lurking in shallow water. It had been a high-speed, deep-diving hunter cutting through dark oceans with precision. And the realization prepared scientists for the next revelation, that even creatures towering over the land were far more athletic and formidable than anyone had dared imagine. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, paleontology had begun correcting its earliest mistakes. Dinosaurs were no longer imagined as purely swamp-bound reptiles, and marine reptiles had been reinterpreted as efficient swimmers. Yet one major assumption remained deeply rooted in scientific thinking. Large animals, especially heavy ones, were believed to be slow. This belief came not from carelessness, but from observation. Among living animals, the biggest species tend to move deliberately. Elephants do not sprint across plains for long distances. Rhinoceroses charge briefly but tire quickly. Massive bodies carry momentum that is difficult to start and stop. So when paleontologists uncovered fossils of enormous flightless birds, they interpreted them through that same principle. In South America, particularly in Argentina and Uruguay, fossil hunters discovered skeletons of birds unlike any alive today. They stood taller than a human. Their skulls were massive, ending in a hooked beak shaped like a meat cleaver. The legs were thick and powerful, yet the wings were reduced to useless stubs. These birds could not fly. They were given the name Phorusrhacos, but the public would later know them by a more dramatic title, terror birds. Despite their intimidating appearance, early researchers did not imagine them as swift hunters. The skull looked heavy. The body mass seemed great. Without wings, they resembled oversized ground birds like ostriches, which were known primarily as herbivores or opportunistic feeders. The prevailing interpretation cast them as scavengers, slowly wandering open landscapes, searching for carcasses left behind by mammalian predators. This idea fit comfortably within a broader narrative of prehistoric ecosystems. Mammals, especially carnivorous ones, were thought to dominate the land after the age of reptiles. Birds, even large ones, were assumed to occupy secondary roles. A giant bird might intimidate smaller animals, but it would not actively chase prey. Early reconstructions reinforced this view. Museums displayed Phorusrhacos standing upright and static, like a statue guarding a field. Its legs were drawn thick, but not particularly long. The beak was portrayed as a tearing tool, used after prey was already dead. Some illustrations even showed the bird feeding alongside mammalian predators, waiting patiently rather than competing. The first doubts appeared when scientists studied the leg bones more carefully. Unlike the column-like limbs of heavy mammals, the bones were elongated and hollow in structure, yet reinforced internally. This is a design optimized not for slow walking, but for reducing weight while maintaining strength. Further examination of joint surfaces revealed something unexpected. The knee and ankle allowed forward-backward motion in a narrow plane, minimizing sideways rotation. Such restriction stabilizes the limb during rapid running. Modern cursorial animals like horses and cheetahs show similar adaptations. Stability in a straight line allows greater speed without energy wasted in lateral movement. But the most surprising discovery came from footprint trackways preserved in ancient sediments. Several track patterns indicated long stride lengths inconsistent with slow movement. The spacing between steps suggested high-speed locomotion, especially considering the animal's estimated size. Still, skepticism remained. Large birds today rarely hunt actively. The secretary bird kills prey, but does not chase it over distance. Vultures scavenge. Ostriches flee rather than attack. Scientists hesitated to imagine a bird dominating predators in open terrain. Then biomechanical modeling entered the field. By calculating muscle attachment points and estimating mass distribution, researchers reconstructed the center of gravity. They discovered Phorusrhacos balanced almost perfectly over its hips, allowing efficient forward propulsion. The tail feathers, though not preserved, likely acted as stabilizers, much like in modern running birds. The skull, once considered an obstacle to speed, proved equally revealing. The beak was not only large, but reinforced along specific stress lines. The shape concentrated force at the tip, suitable for delivering downward strikes rather than tearing flesh slowly. This implied an attack method more violent than scavenging. Neck vertebrae were short and robust near the base, but flexible toward the head. Such configuration allows rapid acceleration of the skull downward, like a hammer. Instead of biting repeatedly, the bird could strike with precision, potentially stunning or killing prey instantly. These features collectively suggested a predator built for pursuit and impact, not patience. Environmental context supported this interpretation. During the period these birds lived, South America was geographically isolated. Many familiar mammalian carnivores had not yet arrived. The ecosystems were filled with herbivorous mammals lacking defenses against fast avian hunters. In such a setting, a large flightless bird could occupy the top predator niche. Gradually, the old image weakened. Phorusrhacos was no longer a passive scavenger trailing behind mammals. It was likely the primary hunter shaping the behavior of entire prey populations. But accepting this required overturning a psychological barrier. Humans tend to associate birds with fragility, even large ones. The concept of a 2-meter-tall bird sprinting across plains to deliver lethal blows with its beak felt unnatural compared to mammalian predators. Yet the bones told a consistent story. Every anatomical feature aligned with speed and aggression. The misunderstanding had arisen from analogy once again. Scientists had compared it to modern birds because that was familiar. But modern ecosystems do not contain a true equivalent. The terror bird was not an oversized ostrich. It was an ecological role that no longer exists. As more fossils of terror birds were discovered across South America, the pattern became impossible to ignore. These birds varied in size, from forms comparable to a human to giants exceeding 3 meters in height, yet their anatomy remained remarkably consistent. Long, powerful legs, compact bodies, and massive heads built for impact appeared again and again across multiple species separated by time. Such repetition suggested not an experimental lineage, but a successful one. To understand how they lived, researchers turned to physics rather than assumption. By estimating muscle volume from attachment scars on the femur and pelvis, they calculated potential running speed. The results were startling. Even conservative estimates suggested speeds rivaling large mammalian predators. Some models indicated sprint capabilities comparable to a horse over short distances. The ankle joint played a critical role. In heavy animals, joints often sacrifice speed for stability, but terror birds showed a locking mechanism that stabilized the leg when fully extended. This allowed the limb to act like a spring, storing and releasing energy with each stride. The foot contacted the ground briefly before pushing off again, minimizing time lost during each step. The toes were narrow and forward-facing, reducing drag against the soil. Claws were not designed for grappling large prey, but for traction during acceleration. Everything pointed to forward motion. The skull revealed the second phase of the hunt. Bite force measurements showed that although the beak could exert significant pressure, it was not ideal for prolonged grappling. Instead, the reinforced tip concentrated force into a small area. Computer simulations demonstrated that a downward strike from the head could fracture bone. The neck muscles were arranged to accelerate the skull rapidly, turning the head into a striking weapon. Rather than wrestle prey to the ground like a mammal, the bird likely relied on repeated high-speed impacts. A chase ended not with a bite, but with a blow. This hunting strategy solved a long-standing puzzle. Why evolve such a large head on a running body if it hindered balance? The answer was that the head was the weapon. Speed delivered it. Each stride prepared the strike. Fossilized prey bones bearing puncture marks matched the curvature and spacing of terror bird beaks. Some bones showed healing around earlier injuries, implying animals survived initial attacks only to encounter the predator again later. The ecosystem was shaped by a hunter capable of targeting repeatedly rather than consuming instantly. The isolation of South America amplified this role. Without large placental carnivores, herbivorous mammals developed body plans optimized against different threats. Many relied on size rather than speed. Some evolved armor, but little agility. Against a fast-striking bird, these defenses were ineffective. Over millions of years, the terror birds diversified. Smaller species hunted in dense woodland, using maneuverability instead of pure speed. Larger species dominated open plains, chasing prey across distance. Each variation filled a niche normally occupied elsewhere by mammalian carnivores. The arrival of land bridges connecting South America to North America marked a turning point. Mammalian predators, such as saber-toothed cats and large canids, migrated south. For the first time, terror birds faced competitors with comparable speed and greater grappling ability. The fossil record shows a gradual decline after this event. Injuries on bird bones increased, suggesting more dangerous encounters. The strategy of strike and retreat was less effective against predators capable of endurance, pursuit, and pack coordination. Over time, the terror birds vanished. Their disappearance reinforced earlier misunderstandings. Later scientists, examining only the final remnants, interpreted them as unsuccessful or primitive. Because they did not survive into the present, they were assumed inferior, but this reversed cause and effect. They did not fail due to poor adaptation. They were replaced after millions of years of dominance when environmental connections reshaped the continent. Modern reconstructions now depict Phorosyracos leaning forward, body horizontal, legs extended in mid-stride. The static museum statues of earlier generations have been replaced with dynamic forms frozen in pursuit. The beak is shown descending in a precise arc, rather than hanging passively. The terror bird transformed from a background scavenger into one of the most specialized land predators known. It demonstrated again that prehistoric animals often occupied ecological roles unfamiliar today. When modern comparisons fail, imagination tends to shrink possibilities rather than expand them. Just as marine reptiles were not slow lizards and early dinosaurs were not dragging swamp beasts, these birds were not oversized vultures. They were predators defined by speed and impact, a lineage of hunters that rewrote the rules of avian capability. And their story prepared paleontologists for an even larger correction, one involving the very posture of nearly every dinosaur ever displayed to the public. For much of the 19th and early 20th century, dinosaurs were imagined as evolutionary failures. They were portrayed as enormous reptiles burdened by their own size, doomed to extinction because their bodies could not keep pace with changing conditions. Museums displayed them sprawled across the ground, their bellies nearly touching the earth and their tails carving deep trenches behind them. This image did not arise randomly. It came from the way living reptiles move. Crocodiles and lizards could not support their weight on land. Water, it was argued, would buoy the body and prevent collapse. Artists painted massive animals, were shown waddling awkwardly with bent limbs, barely lifting themselves above the ground, their tails dragged continuously, leaving grooves in the mud. Textbooks described them as slow and dim-witted, creatures that survived only because predators were equally clumsy. The swamp theory became foundational. Entire prehistoric landscapes were imagined as steaming wetlands filled with half-submerged reptiles. Climate reconstructions followed. Scientists reasoned that such animals required constant warmth and humidity. Therefore, ancient Earth must have been uniformly tropical. The first cracks in this interpretation appeared through trackways rather than bones. In several regions, long sequences of dinosaur footprints were discovered preserved in hardened sediment. These tracks showed clear footprints, but lacked any central tail groove. If the tail dragged, it should leave a mark between the feet. Researchers initially dismissed the discrepancy. Perhaps the tail occasionally lifted. Perhaps the ground was firm enough not to record it. Yet, as more trackways were found across different continents and geological layers, the absence remained consistent. Then skeletal anatomy was re-examined. The tail vertebrae of many dinosaurs possessed long overlapping processes that interlocked with neighboring bones. This structure formed a stiff rod, not a flexible appendage capable of bending downward easily. To drag along the ground, the tail would require constant muscular effort to hold an unnatural position. In addition, the hip joint faced directly downward rather than outward. Mammals and birds share this feature, allowing the legs to support weight beneath the body. Reptiles with sprawling limbs have sideways-oriented hip sockets. Dinosaurs did not match that design. Biomechanical studies showed that a sprawling posture would dislocate joints under such mass. The bones were engineered for vertical support, meaning the animals walked with limbs directly under their bodies. If the body was elevated, the tail naturally aligned horizontally as a counterbalance. The center of gravity provided the final piece. A long neck extending forward shifts weight ahead of the hips. To balance, an equally long tail must extend backward. Lowering the tail would tip the animal forward. Raising it maintained stability. The entire body formed a suspended bridge between head and tail. This realization forced a radical reinterpretation. Dinosaurs were not belly-dragging reptiles. They were elevated walkers with efficient weight distribution, capable of sustained terrestrial movement. Apatosaurus, in particular, challenged previous beliefs. Its limbs were column-like, similar to those of elephants, built for supporting weight on land rather than in water. The bone density indicated strong load-bearing rather than buoyant assistance. Furthermore, nasal openings, located high on the skull, had been interpreted as snorkels for submerged living, but closer examination showed they functioned for air passage and resonance rather than breathing underwater. If these animals lived primarily on land, then the swamp habitat was unnecessary. Their size no longer required aquatic support. Instead, they likely roamed floodplains and forests, feeding on vegetation across vast distances. This shift affected predator interpretations as well. Carnivorous dinosaurs such as Allosaurus had long hind limbs and strong tails aligned for balance during movement. Their body heavy mounts and rethinking museum exhibits. Some institutions hesitated, preferring familiar displays over uncertain revisions. But evidence accumulated relentlessly. Each new fossil site confirmed upright posture. Each biomechanical analysis contradicted sprawling motion. The tail-dragging dinosaur slowly vanished from scientific literature. The correction did more than change posture. It changed metabolism. Animals capable of sustained movement across land likely maintained higher activity levels than cold-blooded reptiles. Their growth rates, inferred from bone structure, indicated rapid development, consistent with higher internal energy use. The old world of sluggish giants living half submerged in steaming swamps began to collapse. In its place emerged a landscape filled with active animals walking, feeding, migrating, and interacting on dry ground. The transformation had begun with footprints, but would soon reshape the entire narrative of dinosaur life. As the idea of upright dinosaurs gained acceptance, scientists faced an even greater implication. If dinosaurs carried their bodies high above the ground and balanced their tails horizontally, then movement required constant muscular activity. Such activity consumes energy at a rate far beyond that of cold-blooded reptiles resting in warm environments. The bones themselves preserved evidence of growth patterns. When thin sections were examined under microscopes, the internal structure showed dense networks of blood vessel channels. These features resemble the bone tissue of mammals and birds that grow quickly rather than the slower, layered structure typical of modern reptiles. Growth rings suggested many dinosaurs reached enormous size within surprisingly short spans of years. Rapid growth demands a steady supply of energy. A slow metabolism dependent entirely on environmental heat would not sustain it. The traditional reptile model began to fail not only mechanically but physiologically. The reinterpretation of posture therefore led to a reinterpretation of temperature regulation. Dinosaurs may have generated significant internal heat. This would allow them to remain active across different climates and during cooler periods of the day or night. Trackways found at high paleolatitudes supported this view. Herds traveled through regions that experienced seasonal darkness, something unlikely for animals restricted to constant warmth. Apatosaurus, once depicted as an aquatic giant barely able to lift itself, became a roaming herbivore capable of walking long distances between feeding grounds. Its neck, formerly imagined as a snorkel, functioned instead as a feeding apparatus, sweeping across vegetation without moving the entire body. The stiff tail balanced each step, preventing forward collapse. Stegosaurus also transformed in interpretation. Its plates had been thought purely defensive, protecting a helpless animal from predators. But upright posture and mobility suggested it was not defenseless. The tail spikes, now held clear of the ground, formed an effective swinging weapon. Wear patterns on the spike tips indicated repeated impacts rather than accidental contact. Predatory dinosaurs underwent similar revision. Allosaurus and its relatives had limb proportions suited to active hunting. Their forward-leaning bodies aligned head and tail in a dynamic balance, enabling sudden acceleration and rapid turns. The earlier picture of a lumbering ambush reptile gave way to that of a terrestrial predator capable of chasing prey across open terrain. The environment changed with them. Instead of universal swamps, sediment analysis revealed floodplains, river valleys, and seasonal forests. Soil composition showed periods of drying and re-wetting rather than constant immersion. Fossilized plant communities indicated varied climates, including temperate regions far from equatorial heat. Once posture was corrected, the entire ecological framework shifted. Prehistoric Earth was not a monotonous tropical marsh, but a planet of diverse habitats inhabited by adaptable animals. Dinosaurs occupied niches comparable to modern mammals and large birds, not a separate primitive category. The public image lagged behind. Illustrations in older books persisted, showing tails carving trenches through mud. Films reinforced the outdated model because it appeared dramatic and familiar. Yet, museum exhibits gradually changed. Skeletons were remounted with elevated hips and extended tails. Visitors began seeing animals poised in motion rather than collapsed into the ground. Scientists recognized that earlier reconstructions had been influenced by expectation. Because dinosaurs were reptiles, they were assumed to behave like reptiles. But classification alone does not dictate lifestyle. Evolution can produce active forms within any lineage when environmental pressures demand it. Further discoveries strengthened the conclusion. Some trackways preserve running gaits with long stride spacing and alternating foot placement consistent with balanced motion. No tail impressions accompanied these prints even in soft substrates. The absence was no longer an anomaly, but a defining characteristic. The correction also opened the possibility of complex behavior. Herd movement patterns suggested coordination. Nesting sites showed repeated use across seasons. Upright posture freed the forelimbs in certain species, enabling manipulation of food or interaction with offspring. In effect, dinosaurs transitioned in scientific understanding from oversized reptiles to a distinct category of terrestrial vertebrates with their own physiology and behavioral strategies. The realization did not make them mammals or birds, but it removed the assumption that they were inherently inferior or limited. The long persistence of the tail-dragging image demonstrated how strongly first impressions shape interpretation. For decades, evidence existed that contradicted the model, yet it was explained away because the established picture seemed obvious. Only when multiple independent lines of data converged did the paradigm finally change. By the mid-20th century, a new vision emerged. Dinosaurs stood tall, walked efficiently, and inhabited varied landscapes. They were not evolutionary dead ends, but successful animals that dominated Earth for millions of years. This shift prepared paleontologists to reconsider other prehistoric giants whose lifestyles had also been simplified. Among them was a massive crocodilian relative, once imagined as a passive river lurker, but destined to become something far more formidable in the scientific imagination. Crocodiles are among the most familiar large predators alive today. They float quietly at the water's edge, barely moving, waiting for an animal to approach. When the moment comes, they explode upward in a brief burst of violence and drag the prey underwater. Then they return to stillness. Their lifestyle is defined by patience rather than pursuit. Because crocodiles have changed relatively little over millions of years, early paleontologists assumed their extinct relatives behaved the same way. When enormous crocodilian fossils were discovered, they were interpreted as oversized versions of modern ambush predators. Larger teeth, larger jaws, but the same strategy. In the Sahara Desert, fragments of an immense skull began appearing in scattered locations during the 20th century. The bones were massive even by dinosaur standards. The snout alone measured over 1 meter in length. Teeth thicker than a human finger filled sockets along the jaw. Eventually, enough material was collected to identify a new species, later named Sarcosuchus, meaning flesh crocodile. Estimates suggested the animal exceeded 10 meters in length and weighed several tons. The immediate conclusion was straightforward. It must have lived in rivers, lying submerged like a modern crocodile, but capable of attacking much larger prey that approached the shoreline. Dinosaurs would occasionally fall victim when they came to drink. Early illustrations reinforced this image. Sarcosuchus was shown half buried in muddy water, eyes and nostrils above the surface, waiting motionless for hours. The massive snout was interpreted as an adaptation for gripping struggling animals and holding them underwater until they drowned. But as more complete fossils were studied, inconsistencies appeared. The snout, although long, was not shaped exactly like that of modern crocodiles specializing in large prey. Instead of being deep and robust along its entire length, it tapered and broadened near the tip, forming a bulbous structure. At first, this was dismissed as a minor variation, but detailed examination showed a network of sensory openings across the surface. Modern crocodiles possess pressure sensors along their jaws that detect water movement. Sarcosuchus had them as well, but arranged in patterns suggesting detection across a wide area rather than just directly in front of the mouth. This indicated a predator attentive to movement in open water, not merely at the bank. The teeth also differed. Rather than the crushing conical teeth typical of animals that seize large struggling prey, many were more slender and evenly spaced. Where patterns indicated repeated contact with smaller active animals rather than occasional impact with massive victims. The vertebrae provided another clue. The spine showed flexibility suited to sweeping lateral motion, yet the limb bones were proportionally longer than in most modern crocodiles. Longer limbs elevate the body above the ground and allow more efficient walking. This contradicted the assumption of a creature spending nearly all its time submerged. Sediment surrounding the fossils revealed river channels, but also open floodplain deposits. Sarcosuchus bones were not restricted to deep water environments. Some were found in areas representing shallow channels and exposed banks where large dinosaurs walked regularly. If the animal remained constantly hidden underwater, such distribution would be unusual. Biomechanical analysis of the jaws deepened the mystery. The bite force was enormous, but the structure of the skull distributed stress along the snout rather than concentrating it only at the base. This configuration resists twisting forces during lateral shaking, suggesting prey capture involving rapid side-to-side motion. Combined with the sensory structures, the evidence began to imply an active hunter patrolling waterways rather than waiting passively. The tail musculature reinforced this possibility. Attachment points indicated powerful swimming strokes capable of bursts of speed in open water. Modern crocodiles can lunge quickly but tire rapidly. Sarcosuchus proportions suggested longer sustained motion, closer to pursuit than ambush. The change in interpretation required imagining a predator interacting differently with dinosaurs. Instead of rare encounters at the riverbank, the giant crocodilian might have entered shallow areas to chase prey or intercept animals crossing waterways. The concept seemed radical. Crocodiles were the archetype of patience, yet the anatomy did not fully match that lifestyle. As researchers compared it to other extinct crocodilian relatives, they realized the group once contained a wide variety of ecological roles. Some species were fully terrestrial, others had snouts adapted for fish. Sarcosuchus may have represented a semi-aquatic predator capable of active engagement with large animals. The old image of a motionless monster lurking beneath the surface began to erode. In its place emerged a more dynamic picture of rivers where massive reptiles moved through channels with purpose, not merely waiting, but seeking opportunity. The prehistoric shoreline became more dangerous than previously imagined. As the anatomical details accumulated, paleontologists began testing how Sarcosuchus would actually move in its environment. Computer models simulated buoyancy, limb range, and muscle force. The results challenged nearly every aspect of the traditional ambush predator interpretation. Modern crocodiles are optimized for short, explosive attacks from concealment. Their bodies sit low to the ground, and while they can perform a raised walk, it is energetically costly over distance. Sarcosuchus, however, possessed limb proportions that allowed the torso to remain elevated more comfortably. The joints supported forward movement without the extreme side-to-side body bending typical of living species. This meant it could travel along shorelines and shallow channels more efficiently than a modern crocodile of similar size. Instead of waiting in a single location, it likely patrolled a territory. The structure of the snout tip provided another insight. The bulbous expansion at the end was filled with sensory pits capable of detecting subtle pressure changes in water. In living crocodilians, these organs help locate struggling prey. In Sarcosuchus, they were distributed broadly, allowing detection across a wider area. This would be useful for tracking animals moving through water rather than only sensing vibrations immediately above the jaws. Fossil fish bones, discovered in association with the skull, showed scoring patterns consistent with quick lateral sweeps rather than vertical crushing bites. The predator appeared to seize prey in motion, snapping sideways through schools or striking at animals attempting to cross rivers. Yet, the most striking evidence came from dinosaur bones found in the same formations. Some bore deep punctures matching the spacing and diameter of Sarcosuchus teeth. The marks indicated powerful clamping force, followed by rotational movement, a behavior used to subdue prey larger than the predator can swallow whole. This suggested encounters were not rare accidents. Dinosaurs were part of its diet. However, instead of a single explosive grab at the bank, the attack likely unfolded differently. A dinosaur entering shallow water would face a predator capable of rapid swimming bursts toward it, not merely upward lunges. Once contact occurred, the crocodilian could twist and destabilize the animal before retreating into deeper water or forcing it off balance. The tail musculature supported repeated propulsion strokes, implying the animal could reposition during the struggle. Unlike modern crocodiles that rely heavily on drowning, Sarcosuchus may have relied on mechanical injury and exhaustion, particularly when targeting juvenile or medium-sized dinosaurs. Environmental reconstruction aligned with this view. The ancient Sahara region at the time consisted of wide river systems with seasonal fluctuations. Animals frequently crossed channels while migrating between feeding areas. A mobile aquatic predator would exploit these predictable routes more effectively than one confined to a single hiding place. The teeth themselves revealed feeding frequency. Continuous replacement patterns indicated regular use, not occasional large meals separated by long rest periods. This is consistent with an animal actively hunting smaller prey often and larger prey opportunistically. Gradually, the image of Sarcosuchus shifted from a scaled-up crocodile to a specialized predator occupying a niche somewhere between crocodile and large aquatic carnivore. It was neither a constant swimmer, like marine reptiles, nor a purely sedentary ambusher. It was an active participant in river ecosystems, influencing where and when dinosaurs approached water. This reinterpretation changed perceptions of prehistoric risk. Herbivorous dinosaurs gathering near rivers had long been portrayed as safe once they avoided large terrestrial carnivores. Now waterways became zones of continual danger. A crossing could trigger pursuit, not just ambush. The misunderstanding had arisen because living crocodiles were used as a universal model, but modern species represent only a surviving subset of a once diverse lineage. Extinct relatives experimented with different strategies, some far more aggressive in movement and engagement. Museum displays began depicting Sarcosuchus partially out of water, body lifted on limbs, head turning toward approaching animals. The static log-like monster gave way to a roaming predator. Though still capable of waiting, it was no longer restricted to patience. The correction reinforced a recurring lesson in paleontology. Present-day behavior cannot always define past life. Evolution preserves successful designs, but also eliminates others, leaving only fragments of former diversity. Assuming all members of a lineage behave identically obscures possibilities. Sarcosuchus demonstrated that even familiar animal groups once filled unfamiliar ecological roles. The rivers of the past were not quiet barriers, but contested pathways where predators actively interacted with land animals. And beyond those rivers lived creatures whose very identity had once been misread so drastically that scientists mistook a peaceful herbivore for a monstrous killer. In the late 18th century, before dinosaurs were even recognized, naturalists encountered fossils that defied all known categories. Among the strangest were enormous claws discovered in South America. They were curved, thick, and longer than a human forearm. No living animal possessed anything comparable. At the time, extinction itself was still debated. Many scholars believed every creature ever created still existed somewhere in unexplored regions. If such gigantic claws were found, then a gigantic beast must still roam distant lands. The imagination filled the gaps quickly. The first major specimen reached Europe through colonial expeditions in Argentina. The bones included limb fragments and several massive claws, but lacked a complete skull or body. Without a familiar reference point, scientists compared the claws to known predators. Large, curved talons suggested a carnivore, perhaps a land version of a bear or a monstrous feline. The animal was named Megatherium, meaning great beast. Early illustrations showed a towering predator rearing upright, using its claws to seize prey or rip apart carcasses. Some depictions portrayed it attacking other large animals, standing like a giant bear armed with scythes. This interpretation seemed reasonable. Claws that large must serve a violent purpose. Herbivores graze, carnivores tear, and these claws appeared built for tearing. However, the rest of the skeleton complicated the story. When more bones were recovered, the limbs proved extremely robust, almost column-like. The pelvis was wide and heavy, capable of supporting enormous weight. The teeth lacked sharp cutting edges. Instead, they were blunt and suited for grinding. These contradictions puzzled researchers. A predator with no slicing teeth made little sense. Yet the claws still appeared too formidable for peaceful feeding. Some proposed the animal dug for roots or broke into termite mounds. Others insisted it scavenged large carcasses rather than hunted. The misunderstanding persisted because the creature had no modern equivalent of similar size. Small tree sloths existed, but they were slow and delicate, hanging from branches in tropical forests. No one imagined a sloth could reach elephant scale. The decisive clue came from joint structure. The hind limbs and tail formed a tripod support system. When the animal reared back, it could balance upright without strain. The forelimbs then extended upward rather than forward. This position did not favor grappling prey, but pulling vegetation. Wear patterns on the claws revealed flattened tips rather than sharp points. They were used repeatedly against rough surfaces, not flesh. The curvature allowed hooking branches and drawing them downward. The jaw mechanics reinforced the idea. The chewing motion moved side to side, grinding plant fibers efficiently. Such movement is unnecessary for meat consumption, but essential for breaking tough vegetation. Gradually, a new picture emerged. Megatherium was not a predator, but a giant ground sloth feeding on leaves and branches above its height. It stood upright, braced by its tail, and used its claws to pull entire limbs of trees within reach. The fearsome weapon was a feeding tool, but accepting this required abandoning an emotional reaction. The claws looked dangerous, and human intuition associates large, sharp structures with aggression. Scientists had projected familiar predator logic onto an unfamiliar herbivore. As additional skeletons were found, stomach content traces and coprolites confirmed plant material. The giant beast once imagined stalking prey was in fact a specialized browser shaping vegetation patterns across prehistoric plains. The misinterpretation lasted decades, illustrating again how fragmentary fossils encourage dramatic conclusions. Without context, anatomy can mislead. A structure evolved for one function may resemble another superficially. Megatherium's reputation slowly changed from terror to engineer of its ecosystem. Yet its claws still held defensive potential, suggesting that even peaceful giants possessed formidable protection against predators. Once Megatherium was understood as a herbivore, scientists began re-examining the rest of its anatomy with a different perspective. Features that once appeared awkward or contradictory suddenly fit together into a coherent lifestyle. The enormous pelvis and reinforced tail vertebrae formed a stable base when the animal lifted its torso upright. Unlike a bear standing briefly, this creature could remain balanced for extended periods. The tail acted as a third leg, distributing weight so the hind limbs were not overloaded. This posture freed the forelimbs to operate at heights unreachable by most herbivores of its time. The claws, previously imagined as slashing weapons, were ideal for pulling branches downward. Their curvature hooked around trunks and limbs, while the powerful shoulder muscles generated steady force. Instead of tearing flesh, they stripped foliage and bark. Microscopic scratches on fossilized claw surfaces matched abrasion from wood rather than bone. The teeth supported the conclusion. They lacked enamel and sharp edges, but formed continuously growing, grinding surfaces. Wear patterns showed constant contact with fibrous plants. Jaw muscles were arranged for side-to-side chewing, crushing vegetation into digestible material. The skull was elongated to house these muscles, giving the head a shape unfamiliar to carnivores. Evidence from fossilized dung revealed seeds and plant fragments from shrubs and low trees. Megatherium likely shaped the landscape by clearing vegetation, opening paths, and dispersing seeds across wide areas. Its feeding behavior may have influenced plant evolution, encouraging species adapted to heavy browsing pressure. The animal's slow movement, once interpreted as lethargy, now appeared strategic. Massive herbivores conserve energy while feeding over large territories. The limbs were built not for speed, but for stability, allowing it to traverse uneven ground and support its weight during upright feeding. Predators would find it difficult to topple such a balanced structure. Defensive use of the claws remained possible. If threatened, the sloth could swing its forelimbs outward in powerful arcs. The same strength used to pull branches could repel attackers. Bite marks on some fossils healed during life suggest encounters with predators that failed to kill the animal. This reinterpretation also altered the ecological picture of prehistoric South America. Megatherium was not a rare curiosity, but part of a community of large herbivores. Alongside armored glyptodonts and litopterm mammals, it formed a guild of plant consumers, filling roles later occupied by elephants and rhinos elsewhere. The earlier predator image had distorted that ecosystem. Scientists once imagined constant violent competition among giant carnivores. Instead, the landscape contained stable herbivore populations, shaping vegetation over long periods. Large predators existed but were fewer and specialized in different prey. The change highlighted a recurring pattern in paleontology. Dramatic features often lead to dramatic assumptions. Humans instinctively associate size and weapon-like structures with aggression. Yet, evolution frequently produces powerful tools for non-violent purposes. Horns can display, tusks can dig, and claws can harvest food. Megatherium became a case study in restraint of interpretation. When fossils are incomplete, the mind gravitates toward familiar narratives, especially those involving predation. Only when skeletal mechanics, wear patterns, and environmental context align does a more accurate behavior emerge. Museums updated their displays accordingly. The towering attacker was replaced by a massive browser leaning against a tree, pulling branches toward its mouth. The animal's presence felt calmer, yet no less impressive. Instead of terror, it conveyed dominance through size and persistence. By correcting its identity, scientists gained insight into the balance of prehistoric ecosystems. Not every giant creature lived by killing. Some shaped their world simply by eating. And as paleontology advanced, another discovery would challenge assumptions not about diet, but about intelligence and behavior, redefining the nature of dinosaurs themselves. By the mid-20th century, dinosaurs had finally escaped their swamp-bound image. They were now recognized as terrestrial animals capable of walking efficiently across land. Yet another assumption still defined them in scientific and public imagination. They were considered slow thinkers. Even after posture and movement were corrected, dinosaurs remained portrayed as oversized reptiles, driven by instinct rather than strategy. Their brains were believed too small to support complex behavior. The prevailing model described them as automatic creatures reacting to stimuli, not planning actions. Predators attacked whatever moved. Herbivores grazed until attacked. Life was simple and repetitive. This perception began to fracture in the 1960s with the discovery of a relatively modest-sized predator in North America. The skeleton was not gigantic like earlier famous carnivores. It stood roughly the height of a person at the hip. But its anatomy was unlike any dinosaur previously studied in detail. The animal was named Deinonychus, meaning terrible claw. At first glance, the most striking feature was a large sickle-shaped claw on the second toe of each hind foot. Earlier, paleontologists might have assumed it was merely a defensive spur, but its articulation suggested active use during attack. The toe was held off the ground while walking, preserving sharpness, and could be driven downward with force. The limbs were long and lightly built, optimized for speed. The tail contained a lattice of stiffening rods that limited bending but enhanced balance. When the animal turned, the tail would counter-rotate, stabilizing the body much like a tightrope walker's pole. The skull revealed even more. The eyes faced slightly forward, creating overlapping fields of vision. This allowed depth perception, crucial for judging distance during a chase. Most earlier dinosaur predators had been reconstructed with more lateral vision, typical of animals reacting rather than targeting. But the most controversial evidence came from brain size. Relative to body mass, Deinonychus possessed a significantly larger brain than previously known dinosaurs. The inner ear structure suggested refined coordination and balance. The animal was built not just to move, but to control movement precisely. John Ostrom, the paleontologist who described the species, recognized that these features pointed toward an active predator requiring quick decision-making. The anatomy did not match the stereotype of a sluggish reptile. It resembled the efficiency of modern birds of prey. The claw provided the key to hunting strategy. Instead of slashing randomly, its curvature and joint motion indicated it was used to grip prey while the jaws delivered bites. The forelimbs, though smaller, had flexible wrists capable of grasping. The predator likely leapt onto larger animals, maintaining contact while inflicting wounds. Fossil associations strengthened this interpretation. Bones of herbivorous dinosaurs were found with multiple Deinonychus individuals nearby. Some researchers proposed cooperative hunting, suggesting groups targeted prey too large for a single animal. Though debated, the possibility alone challenged the long-held view of dinosaur simplicity. Speed estimates based on leg proportions indicated pursuit rather than ambush. This predator could chase and maneuver, adjusting direction rapidly. The stiff tail prevented over-rotation, enabling tight turns at high velocity. Such agility required advanced neural control. The implications extended beyond one species. If a relatively small dinosaur exhibited bird-like activity and intelligence, perhaps others did as well. The boundary between reptiles and birds blurred. Feathers, once considered unique to birds, became plausible in their ancestors. The discovery triggered what later became known as the dinosaur renaissance. Scientists began re-evaluating metabolism, behavior, and growth rates across many species. Dinosaurs were reconsidered as dynamic animals, interacting in complex ways. Public reaction was gradual. Books and films still portrayed heavy monsters, but academic literature increasingly described active hunters and alert herbivores. Deinonychus served as the first widely accepted example of a dinosaur that looked alive rather than mechanical. The terrible claw had cut through more than flesh in the scientific imagination. It had severed the idea that dinosaurs were merely oversized lizards, opening the possibility that they were energetic animals operating under rules closer to those of birds and mammals. As Deinonychus gained attention within the scientific community, researchers began re-examining older dinosaur specimens that had long sat in museum collections. Bones, once catalogued and forgotten, suddenly carried new meaning when viewed through the lens of activity rather than lethargy. One of the most revealing changes involved trackways. Earlier, footprints were interpreted mainly as proof of presence. Now, scientists analyze spacing, depth, and direction changes. Some tracks showed coordinated turning patterns and consistent distances between individuals. Instead of random wandering, they suggested animals moving with awareness of one another. While cooperative hunting remains debated, the evidence clearly indicated behavioral complexity beyond solitary instinctive movement. Dinosaurs reacted to each other, adjusted speed, and navigated terrain with precision. Such coordination requires sensory processing and rapid decision-making. The forelimbs of Deinonychus reinforced this conclusion. The wrist joint allowed the hand to fold inward, bringing the claws toward the midline. This motion resembled the wing-folding action of birds. Though feathers were not yet confirmed in this species at the time, the mechanics hinted at a shared evolutionary foundation. The forelimbs could grasp prey, hold objects, or stabilize the body during attack. Bone microstructure revealed rapid growth rates comparable to large mammals. An animal that grows quickly must feed frequently and maintain consistent activity. This contradicted the notion of a predator spending most of its life resting and waiting for rare opportunities. Instead, it likely hunted regularly, maintaining territory and responding to environmental change. Predatory strategy also evolved in interpretation. Rather than delivering a single killing bite, Deinonychus probably inflicted repeated wounds, weakening prey through blood loss and shock. The sickle claw, positioned above ground during running, could strike downward during leaps. Once attached, the jaws and forelimbs worked together to maintain grip while the hind legs stabilized balance. This coordinated use of multiple body parts suggested an integrated nervous system capable of controlling simultaneous movements. The animal was not simply biting whatever touched its mouth. It was executing sequences of actions. As these ideas spread, they affected the entire dinosaur lineage. Large herbivores previously imagined as passive now appeared capable of defensive group behavior. Herding trackways showed juveniles protected within the center of moving groups. Nesting sites containing multiple age groups indicated parental presence after hatching. The gap between dinosaurs and birds narrowed further when comparisons of bone histology revealed similarities in respiratory structure. Air-filled spaces within bones reduced weight and improved oxygen exchange efficiency. High oxygen intake supports sustained activity, reinforcing the image of energetic animals rather than slow reptiles. The cultural impact followed. Illustrations began portraying dinosaurs with elevated posture, alert heads, and dynamic movement. Instead of waiting to be attacked, prey animals watched surroundings. Predators pursued with calculated motion. The prehistoric world became interactive rather than static. Deinonychus did not directly prove intelligence equal to mammals, but it demonstrated capacity far beyond reflex-driven behavior. It represented a turning point where scientists stopped asking whether dinosaurs were active and began asking how they interacted. The broader realization was that extinction had removed not primitive failures, but successful organisms adapted to their time. Their disappearance did not erase their complexity. It simply left no modern equivalent large enough to remind us by the end of the 20th century, dinosaurs were no longer categorized as evolutionary stepping stones. They were understood as a parallel branch of advanced terrestrial life, sharing characteristics with birds through common ancestry. The terrible claw had forced a reconsideration of mind as well as body. Dinosaurs were not just moving differently than once believed, they were living differently. And the final correction awaited discovery in stone quarries across China, where impressions in fine sediment would reveal the last misconception humanity held about the appearance of these animals. For over a century, even after posture, behavior, and intelligence were reconsidered, one image remained fixed in the public and scientific mind. Dinosaurs were scaly. Every reconstruction, whether sluggish or active, showed thick reptilian skin. At most, artists added rough textures similar to crocodiles or lizards. Feathers belonged exclusively to birds, and birds were considered descendants of some ancient reptile, but not visually similar to the great dinosaurs themselves. The connection was theoretical rather than visible. The first hints of a different reality appeared quietly. In rare fossils, faint impressions around small dinosaur skeletons suggested filament-like structures. They were dismissed as degraded collagen fibers or plant material trapped during burial. Without clear examples, the idea of feathered dinosaurs remained speculative. Then discoveries in northeastern China transformed the debate. Fine-grained volcanic ash had buried entire ecosystems rapidly, preserving delicate outlines in exceptional detail. Among the fossils were small theropod dinosaurs, surrounded by unmistakable halos of filamentous covering. One species, later named Sinosauropteryx, displayed a coat of simple hair like filaments across its body and tail. The structures did not resemble flight feathers, but primitive strands. Their distribution indicated insulation rather than ornament. This suggested body temperature regulation, reinforcing earlier ideas of elevated metabolism. More species followed. Some possessed branched feathers forming veins similar to modern birds. Others showed long arm feathers arranged symmetrically, unsuitable for powered flight but effective for display or gliding. The range of forms revealed feathers evolved before flight and served multiple purposes. The discovery of Microraptor provided dramatic evidence. This small dinosaur possessed flight feathers not only on its arms, but also on its legs, forming 4 aerodynamic surfaces. Its anatomy indicated controlled gliding between trees. The boundary between dinosaur and bird blurred further. Perhaps the most surprising find involved a large predator. Fossils of Eutyrannus, a relative of famous giant carnivores, preserved long filamentous feathers across much of its body. This animal approached the size of a small tyrannosaur, yet carried insulating covering. The implication was unavoidable. Even large dinosaurs were not universally scaly. Color patterns emerged from microscopic pigment structures preserved within the feathers. Bands of rust red, dark brown, and pale tones appeared across tails and bodies. Dinosaurs were no longer gray reptilian silhouettes, but visually varied animals. These fossils confirmed predictions made decades earlier from skeletal analysis. Air-filled bones, rapid growth, and active lifestyles aligned with the presence of insulation. Feathers provided thermal control, display signals, and aerodynamic assistance. The public image changed rapidly. Textbooks updated illustrations. Museum models were redesigned with plumage. Some resistance persisted because familiar scaly giants had dominated culture for generations, but evidence was undeniable. The realization extended beyond appearance. birds were not merely descendants of dinosaurs, they were dinosaurs. The lineage had never truly vanished, but transformed gradually through adaptation. The prehistoric world, once populated by monstrous reptiles, now resembled a landscape filled with dynamic animals, bearing traits seen in modern wildlife. Movement, behavior, and covering aligned into a coherent picture. Yet, one final question remained unresolved. How did such successful creatures disappear while their feathered descendants survived? Once feathers were accepted as widespread among many theropod dinosaurs, the final boundary separating the ancient world from the modern one dissolved. The difference between a small predatory dinosaur and an early bird became difficult to define. Instead of a sharp transition, the fossil record revealed a gradual continuum. Early birds, such as Archaeopteryx, already displayed a mix of traits. It possessed flight feathers and wings, yet retained teeth, a long bony tail, and clawed fingers. For decades it had been treated as a special intermediate form, a single bridge between reptiles and birds. But the discoveries in China changed that perspective. Archaeopteryx was no longer unique. It was one member of a broad family of feathered dinosaurs, experimenting with different ways of moving through the air. Some species glided between trees, others ran along the ground, flapping their feathered forelimbs for balance or display. The evolution of flight appeared not as a sudden invention, but as an accumulation of functions. Feathers first insulated, then signaled, then aided maneuvering, and only later powered sustained flight. Large predators likely used feathers for temperature control and visual communication. Crests, color bands, and elongated plumes would have allowed individuals to identify mates or rivals at distance. What once seemed a purely reptilian world now resembled an environment filled with movement and visual signals similar to modern ecosystems. The extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period, triggered by asteroid impact and environmental collapse, removed most dinosaur lineages. Yet small feathered species capable of flexible diets and possibly limited flight survived. Their size allowed them to find shelter and adapt to the rapidly changing conditions. Over millions of years, these survivors diversified into the birds familiar today. Sparrows, hawks, and penguins share ancestry with animals once walking among giants. The concept of dinosaurs as vanished monsters became inaccurate. They had not entirely disappeared. They had transformed and endured. This realization completed a long correction in scientific understanding. The earliest reconstructions imagined slow reptiles dragging tails through swamps. Each subsequent discovery reshaped that image step by step. Upright posture revealed mobility. Marine anatomy revealed speed. Claw structure revealed feeding behavior. Brain size revealed activity. Feathers revealed continuity with modern life. Misunderstandings persisted for decades because each assumption was reasonable within the knowledge of its time. Scientists worked with fragments and compared them to familiar animals. Only with new evidence did patterns emerge that contradicted expectation. The study of prehistoric animals thus became not only a search for ancient life, but a study of how interpretation evolves. Each generation revises the picture drawn by the previous one. Confidence is provisional, always open to change when better data appears. Today, museums display dinosaurs in motion, covered in varied textures and colors, interacting within complex environments. They no longer represent evolutionary dead ends, but successful organisms adapted to their eras. Their descendants fill the skies, a living reminder that extinction is not always absolute. The history of misunderstanding these animals reflects the broader process of science itself. Knowledge advances through correction. Every fossil carries information, but understanding depends on perspective. When assumptions shift, the past changes shape. The prehistoric world, once imagined as alien and primitive, now feels connected to the present. The birds outside a window carry echoes of creatures that once dominated Earth. The monsters of old illustrations were never truly monsters, only unfamiliar life interpreted through limited context. And the long effort to understand them demonstrates that the past is not fixed. It becomes clearer as evidence accumulates, revealing a history more dynamic and intricate than anyone first believed.